Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining us from today. And welcome to what is, I'm very sad to say, CDSB's last ever technical webinar. You've joined us today. We're going to talk about the interconnectedness of all the work CDSB has done across the last 15 years, covering the topics of climate, water, biodiversity, and social issues. My name is Marnie McBrien. I'm the Managing Director at the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, and I have the pleasure of being joined today by some of the technical geniuses that make the cogs turn at the back end of our organisation. So first of all, the technical team is led by Ravi Abhivardhana, and Ravi will kick it away. We're also joined by David Asley, who's going to talk about climate and social issues, Laura Clavey, who's going to talk about water and biodiversity, and Sundip, who's going to talk about accounting for climate, make some of those really important links between the front and back of reporting. So CDSB, let's think back 15 years. We were set up, climate in our name, of course. We were set up in 2007 in the absence of a globally accepted approach for reporting climate-related risks and opportunities to capital markets. Now, in a consistent, comparable, decision-useful way. Now, if you think back to 2007, companies were really just starting to get the hang of this, but there was no real clear way to do it. Investors were saying, well, actually, there's loads of great stuff, but it's not consistent and comparable. We can't really use it. And regulators were like, whoa, it's a bit early. We're not there yet. We're not ready to act. And CDSB was set up to fill a gap in the market. And that gap was in the absence of a globally accepted authoritative body that could step in and take over, really lead and put standards into place or guidance into place for a global approach. And in those sort of organizations, or organizations like the OECD or the IFRS Foundation. And I'm delighted to say that as we come to the end of this webinar today, we're going to sort of talk about the rest of our life, because as I said at the beginning, today is, and this is our last technical webinar. Fingers crossed, at the end of this month, we will begin our transition across to the IFRS Foundation, as was announced at COP26 on the 3rd of November, that we will be celebrating our mission as accomplished and moving across our IP and staff to continue the good work and have even more impact as part of the new International Sustainability Standards Board. But that's a bit of the past, a little bit of the future. But I'm not gonna dwell on that right now. What we need to get onto is the really important point, is the internet connectivity of these issues. So we started with climate, and very quickly we were told we were a bit player, and we need to go out and cover all of environmental issues. And then not long after we did that, the pressure came on us to report social issues. And of course, we took the challenge. It took us a while, but we took the challenge, and the pandemic and the transition that we're seeing around climate really helped to push the Secretariat, and David will talk to us about that later. But Ravi, why, we've tackled these in silos, but why should companies not be treating these as they're in silos?
Thanks ever so much, Mardi, and hello everyone. So it's really important that preparers, address the various different sustainability risks and opportunities which a company may be faced with in a very much an interconnected way. It's often well cited by science that there's great connectivity between climate, biodiversity, and social inequality. But ultimately, how do you actually go about that? And what we're talking about here, what CDSB is all about, is reporting material information to the investor. And if you think about this, like an investor picks up your mainstream financial report, and they're looking for clear and consistent information here, and they're looking for clear and consistent information when it comes to sustainability matters. And it's often the case that an entity or an organization goes about reporting on material information around sustainability very much in silo, when in fact they are very much interconnected. So just a very high level interconnection between climate and social, for example. A company is at risk, has a systemic risk from climate. Management have decided to actually mitigate that by changing the direction of the company via from a strategic perspective, investing in new business lines. That will have an impact on its existing workforce. They need to upskill them. So it goes back to the comment of having a just, a just transition. So connectivity means, look, there's connectivity within the actual sustainability themes. So I've just touched upon climate and social. There's also connectivity within the mainstream financial report to do with financial matters as well, which my colleague Sundip will, dig into a little bit later on. So it's going back to what I had mentioned a moment ago. It really is portraying a picture from the company, them having full ownership of the communication which they send to an investor, so that an investor has really a full 360 of all the material information from a financial perspective, which covers sustainability matters, so that they can be informed of all of these deep interconnections. So we've dealt with, we've provided the market, the preparer, yourselves with a plethora of resources, and hopefully at the end of this you'll understand what resources are applicable to you and use them and start to apply them, because as Mardi mentioned just a moment ago, jurisdictions are starting to mandate this sort of thinking, and having just come from a preparer perspective, it takes time to actually introduce such things into companies. So get started now would be my saying. So over to you, Mardi.
Thanks, Ravi. Well said. I couldn't say that better myself. Start preparing, start getting organized, get started now on everything the team are going to talk to you about today. So David, we started with climate. We jumped out there, we started with climate. That's where it all began. Tell us about it, and tell us where we're going and what needs to be done.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mardi, and hello, everyone. So CDSB started on climate back in 2007, and our first framework that we released was wholly focused on climate change issues. And since then, while we've kind of developed into other areas and kind of branched out, we've kind of kept that climate focus. And that's because it's one of, if not the biggest issue of the day. And companies and governments are increasingly realizing that as well. And companies are, beginning to realize, the risks that they face from a kind of the physical impacts of climate change, but also the transition to a low carbon economy. But on the flip side of that as well, when it comes to that kind of transition, companies are also understanding the opportunities that lie in that, whether that's through efficiency, whether that's through new product streams, whether that's completely rechanging their business and thinking about it all again. And in hand with that realization about the risks and the opportunities and the kind of severity is also coming a mainstreaming of climate reporting. So what CDSB has been kind of rattling on about now for a good 10 years is entering into the mainstream. And that's really come on since the TCFD. That's been a great help, and it's kind of taken it into kind of regulators, and it's in the next few years, it's really going to be covering the major economies, we think. And, as well as that, we've also been seeing kind of like ambitions being stepped up as well by governments and companies. So you only need to look at the number of like net zero pledges that are coming out, and they're from as like the biggest companies in the world are now pledging them. Obviously, we can ask questions about the legitimacy of many of those pledges, but it's still a step of what is coming. But as I kind of say, on that legitimacy point, there is still a gulf between the kind of corporate targets around climate change and the action that's really needed. And perhaps some companies are beginning to realize the kind of scale and the speed, but there do need to be steps taken, especially when we realize that, as time goes on, we realize how severe this crisis is, and each new report from the IPCC really hammers that home and kind of emphasizes the scale of the crisis. And as we understand more, populations understand more, investors understand more, the kind of level of expectation is increasing and increasing and increasing. It's going to be driving action more and more and more. But in hand with that expectation is also coming scrutiny. The same greenwashing techniques don't fly anymore. People are beginning to look through company reports and are really probing into what companies are saying and what they're actually doing. And we think that's going to be really driving action in hand with regulation. So we can move to the next slide. So with CDSB's work, we have been trying to provide that means of providing that kind of high quality reporting, which will be able to demonstrate to the market that companies are, they are living up to the expectations they set out. And we do that with a framework that's aligned with the mainstream reporting model. And we do that by trying to create those connections with the back end as well, which Sundip will cover later on in the call. So when it comes to the CDSB framework, it's composed of 7 reporting principles and 12 reporting requirements. So those principles, if you hold them up with those of the ISB, they're very much in line with those, covering the same issues, the same thought processes, same expectations. And then when we look at the kind of like content requirements that we set out in our framework, they similarly cover what you would expect to see in a company's annual report. So, it's their governance structures, their risk management processes, it's what strategies they've got in place, what targets they've got, and also that kind of like forward-looking information as well, which is so important when it comes to climate issues. And what we hope is when we provide this kind of framework to be able to provide climate information alongside other environmental information and hopefully soon to be social information in the mainstream report, is that that's the kind of well-connected, integrated and high quality information that allows capital to move. And, it builds on, those expectations we're seeing in society and those targets that governments and companies are setting out. And as I said earlier, the TCFD has been really important in kind of moving the dial when it comes to climate reporting. And, CDSB is very happy about that because a lot of what we set out in our framework and in our thinking, our approach to this has been replicated in the TCFD. And it's great that what we've been working on for 15 years now has been taken into the mainstream and championed by some of the biggest names in the financial markets. And, it's very obvious when we look at the kind of principles and those requirements of the CDSB framework and the TCFD requirements, that they very much cover the same, pretty much the same stuff. And you kind of illustrated on the slide here. But just because our work's been kind of replicated and built on by the TCFD doesn't mean we've sat on our laurels. These past few years, we've been putting out climate application guidance, which has since been developed further into water and biodiversity issues, which Laura will cover. We've also been working with other voluntary framework providers and standard setters in the market to provide more guidance on how to report on TCFD by using what's already there, particularly with our good friends SASB. So combining our kind of like framework, principles-based approach with their set of metrics. And yeah, I think that covers everything we've got on climate. So back to Marty.
Thanks, David. And as David said, we have a lot of alignment between TCFD and CDSB's work. And until we sunset next week, we've actually applied that in developing the TCFD Knowledge Hub as well. And there's loads of resources on there, how to get started, checklists, all that kind of background material, that can really help you get started, along with a series of e-learning courses, which cover all the core elements of TCFD and well beyond into things like Laura's biodiversity and water, very specific modules for accountants. Because I think what we need to, what TCFD really did that really helped us at CDSB is it said this information needed to be communicated to investors via the mainstream report and accounts. It was the first publication to really get behind us to say, this goes in your main report connected to financial information. The first really big initiative to get behind our approach in doing that. And I think that's helped enormously. I mean, I think the quality is still not there, but I think it's definitely signaled the approach that needs to be taken, and regulators have followed that. So we're going to see, I guess, a lot more in that space in the next few years. Now I'm going to lean across to Sundip, who has been in accounting for climate work, to talk through how you could report on climate change using existing accounting standards.
Thank you, Martin. Hi, everyone. So as David's covered already, much of the focus in recent years and where CDSB started was around climate, and specifically climate-related narrative disclosure. And that focus has continued through the uptake of the TCFD recommendations, which, although voluntary when developed, are increasingly becoming mandatory in a number of jurisdictions. And this reporting is typically expected to be found in the front half of the annual report, management commentary, strategic report, a number of terms for that narrative type of reporting. But the reality is investors, when looking at corporate reporting, are looking at the full package of reporting that both Martin and I've already touched on, both the front half, but also the back half of an annual report, namely the financial statement, financial reporting. And so that leads to kind of a concern that we and others have had as to whether investors are actually being provided with a complete, coherent and consistent story on climate, and whether climate is being appropriately reflected in the financial statements. A simple example, if certain commitments, certain statements are being made in the front half around moving towards, say, net zero, for example, are those assumptions being appropriately considered and reflected and integrated into the financial statements? And this interaction is something we've been thinking about for a while. We actually published a paper in 2018 considering this interaction, and it's titled Uncharted Waters, and the title very much reflecting this idea of climate within financial reporting being relatively uncharted, although in theory something that could be done. But it led to the question as to whether climate can actually be reflected in financial reporting under existing accounting rules, under accounting standards. So significantly in 2019 and 2020, the IASB and IFRS Foundation published 2 papers confirming that although climate is not specifically noted or named within the accounting standards, it is something that should be considered and reflected in reporting. And how and why? Well, the main argument is around materiality. When assessing whether matters, and this can be kind of particularly kind of climate, but any matter in theory, there needs to be a judgment as to whether it is material based on nature or magnitude. Magnitude is obvious enough. If something has a significant sizable impact on the numbers, well, it's got to be reflected in the financials, and appropriate disclosure, explanations, etc. have to be provided. But they also, the standards, and this is ISO I'm referring to, also flag that you have to consider the very nature of the matter at hand. And so in these papers, the Foundation and I have both explained that if investors expect climate to be appropriately reflected and considered and reported in the financials, then its very nature and the fact that you're reporting for the benefit of investors means it's something that should be considered and reflected and reported in financial reporting. And investors themselves have then been clear and actually supported this position, clarifying that they do indeed consider climate to be material to them. And so, for example, in 2020, investors groups representing over 103 trillion in assets under management, a sizable amount of the market came out supporting this position. Also helpful and important to note that auditors and regulators also made public comments and commitments around around their position and their views around considering reflecting climate in financial reporting. And so the next question is actually, well, are companies already doing this, or should they be doing more? Research published last year by PRI found that 70% of companies that they reviewed that were reporting climate in financial statements reporting was inconsistent with disclosures found elsewhere in their reporting, whether in their narrative report or other aspects of their reporting. And so it's clear that whilst there's an expectation that climate needs to be reflected and reported in line with reporting elsewhere within the financial statements, this is happening at the moment. So as a result, CDSB has published 4 papers over the past 2 years to support preparers in advancing this course for appropriately disclosing for the benefit of investors how climate interacts and impacts the financials. So in December 2020, we published our first paper explaining why this needs to be considered by preparers and the expectations by various stakeholders, many have already touched on. And it significantly also goes on to look at a number of standards and try and illustrate how climate interacts in theory with those standards, and is then built on with illustrative examples across a number of different sectors as to what this might look like in practice. Both the accounting treatment when considering climate, but also the financial reporting disclosure as a result. Last year, we then published 2 further supplementary papers looking at further IFRS standards and how these interact with climate. And just this week, we published a final checklist, a practical checklist for preparers to run through as they're preparing the financial statements to just ensure that they are considering climate where material and appropriately reflected in the financials. Now, just 2 final points I want to add here. I've kept referring to the IFRS Foundation and IFRS accounting standards. But it's important to bear in mind that even in the US where IFRS is not applied, FASB, the accounting standard setter there covering the US GAAP, have also published a paper in 2021 looking at the intersectionality between ESG and financial reporting. And so interesting enough, they didn't just focus on climate, but covered kind of ESG and how that might need to be reflected in financial reporting. And that brings me to my last point. I focus today very much on climate, and that's what our papers are focused on. But the reality is other sustainability matters, other environmental matters, other biodiversity, natural capital matters, and social matters may also have financially material impacts on financial reporting. And so my expectation is that as we continue going down this road, there will be increasing expectations from investors, not just on climate to reflect in financial reporting, but other sustainability matters. And that's kind of almost inevitable as we move towards the creation of the ISSB, and that it comes fully full circle back to this idea of interconnectivity, not just between the front half and back half, but also between other sustainability matters, both in the front half and back half.
Thanks, Sam. And I can't stress that enough. You know, we're hearing lots and lots of calls about net zero, for example, and these accounting for climate documents are really helpful in helping you think that through. And the checklist that just come out is really, really useful as well. So download that and have a look even at your existing reports to see how it stacks up against the checklist. It's a good starting point for conversations internally. And just to add to that, we have released last week, David Astley, correct me if I'm wrong, a paper on reporting against net zero, what this should look like across your reporting as a whole, as well as next week, just to help support the cause of why this should be in the mainstream report. We do actually have pretty much a paper coming out that's titled, you know, why the annual report, you know, really to make the case for why it's important that the information goes in, because it's still, you know, in a decision useful way, because it is still very much falling short, and PRI's Flying Blind report really does highlight that. So thanks for bringing that up, Sunday. Now let's seamlessly move along to beyond 2015, where we expanded our remit to environment. And like we do for all of the things we cover, the questions we get asked all the time in the Secretariat regarding our framework is, how do I do it? Who's doing it? What does it look like? And so all of the guidance that we develop, all of the papers, we always make sure they answer those questions and they're useful for market participants. So Laura, what have we done on climate? What have we done on water and biodiversity? Let's leave climate aside for a minute. And how does it connect back to climate and social issues?
Thank you, Marty. Before I jump into it, just a quick note of why we consider water and biodiversity. So a huge financial risk that are generated from the loss of nature. A statistic that gets thrown around quite a lot is that more than 50% of global GDP, which is equivalent to $44 trillion, is moderately or highly dependent on nature and the goods and services it provides. An example of the risk this generates is that deforestation and land degradation costs as much as $6.3 trillion a year due to impacts on forest and agricultural productivity. So as a response to this, at CDSB, we developed a series of application guidance to our framework, which, as previously mentioned, includes climate, but both water and biodiversity, which we're going to cover now. So the aim is to assist report preparers in the disclosure of material water and biodiversity related information to investors via the mainstream report. Both application documents were produced in collaboration with our technical working groups, and these contains experts from NGOs, corporations, governments, and financial institutions. We also undertook thorough literature reviews of existing documentation, held public consultations, and piloted reports with companies. The links are on the screen if you'd like to look more closely, and also put them in the chat. And just note as well, there are e-learning courses that are available on the TCFD Knowledge Hub, and the link is also in the slide. So moving on to the content, each application guidance covers 6 different reporting areas. So this is governance, policy, strategies and targets, risks and opportunities, environmental impacts, performance, and future outlook. For each of these requirements, there's a disclosure checklist, details reporting suggestions, references to external resources, and examples of good practice from corporate mainstream reports. There are also disclosure roadmaps which can help with this process. If we move on to the next slide, we have examples of key characteristics that organisations should consider when they're preparing their biodiversity and water disclosures. These need to be considered because they add complexity, especially when organisations are attempting to report in an integrated manner and report with climate as well. I'll just run through some of these as examples. So the first one we have is the spatial dimension. So biodiversity and water are both location specific. For biodiversity, certain areas will hold more valuable biodiversity than others, and similarly, water issues depend on the particular water basin they're located in. Moving on to the time dimension, both biodiversity and water impacts and dependencies vary with the natural dynamics within and across years, and this could be example due to species migration in the case of biodiversity, but seasonality for both water and biodiversity. The next key characteristic is multifaceted qualities. So with climate, it's relatively simple to measure your impacts because you are focusing on the company's emissions, but both biodiversity and water are a little bit more complicated than this. There's multiple issues to consider. So for biodiversity, you can focus on species abundance, species richness, ecosystem degradation, and similarly, there are varied water issues, such as water supply, water demand, water quality, and the different sources of water. For both biodiversity and water, engagement and collaboration are really important with stakeholders. They're shared resources that you share with the stakeholders in the same vicinity as you. So therefore, it's necessary to engage and make sure that everyone is using them sustainably, because otherwise impacts from other stakeholders, but also affects the organisation's use of them. Most impacts are in the value chain, so there's also the need to engage with the value chain. And finally, moving on to interconnectivity, which is the most important one, is how they are connected between the different natural capitals. So there are both shared impacts and drivers, and this means that changes to one natural capital can compound changes in another. There are also synergies and trade-offs between different business responses to these issues that management needs to consider. I think the best way to demonstrate the interconnectivity is through an example, which we have on the next slide. So looking at the left-hand side of the slide, it shows examples of drivers of business natural capital impacts. So there's land use, resource exploitation, pollution, and climate change. The example I'm going to focus on here is pollutants being accidentally released into a local river by an organisation. And this results in a number of different environmental changes. So from the water side, this can create a loss of water quality. And from the biodiversity side, this can create the reduction in water quality can result in ecosystem degradation and also the poisoning of species that live in the river. This is also connected to climate change because the ecosystem degradation may affect the river's ability to adapt to climate change, which can create an increase of floods or droughts. It can also affect its ability to absorb carbon from the atmosphere. So these combined natural capital changes create financial implications for the business. These could include fines, penalties, cleanup costs, but also reduced access to water, which the company may be dependent on, and this can create higher water costs. It will also have impacts to society, which creates links to social issues. This is health issues for the local community that's caused by the pollution in the water or reduced access to water for them. This can have the further ability to create costs for the organisation, which may be due to reputational damage or fines as examples. So just from this relatively simple example, it's clear that they're very integrated issues, and it's important to consider the different links between them when evaluating the risks to your organisation and that constitutes really important information for investment. Back to Marty.
Thanks, Laura. I'm always, I remember I'm a forester originally. Most of you know that I've been following our work for a long time. But what really hit me when we started to develop the biodiversity and the water guidance was the spatial element. It was much different to climate change. It's much more localized. It needs to be thought about much differently. And I really like the way, Laura, that you talked that through, and it does truly get me thinking. So we couldn't finish. We absolutely couldn't finish our work at CDSB if we didn't tie off all of ESG. And ESG, often the social, we had a webinar a few weeks ago, David and I, where we were talking about the social consultation that we had out to expand our framework to cover all of the ESG issues. And one of our panelists said, the S is often the poor, the left out poor middle child of the ESG acronym. And, we need all these things to be covered, with the same proportionality, but also, with the same depth and the same rigor. So I'm really pleased what we have managed at CDSB before we pass down below the horizon to cover this as part of our framework. David, tell us what we've been doing.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. And I suppose this talking about social builds off very well from where Laura left us as well, talking about those interconnections between environmental issues, but how they also then loop through social issues as well. And this is something that CDSB is kind of increasingly been coming aware to. Just as when we started our work, we had that kind of quite a big focus on climate change, and then with time we understood that you can't really separate climate issues from water, from biodiversity, from other bits of pollution, from emissions, from waste. And likewise, when we're thinking about environmental, you can't really separate that from the kind of impacted people as well. And what's particularly important for us, from our perspective, from that kind of starting off at environmental, is what Laura hinted at as well, is the fact that it's impacts on people which often raise environmental issues up the agenda, whether that's impacts on consumers, whether that's impacts on communities, or whether that's impacts on workers, for instance. So that's what provides the kind of dynamism almost to materiality. It's what takes climate change from that impacts materiality lens into that financial materiality lens quite often. So that was one of the key motivations for CDSB to kind of branch into social issues, is to provide companies with that completeness to assist them in their reporting. But we also saw that social issues are rising up the agenda. We're hearing from the biggest investors in the world. It's not just climate, perhaps water, perhaps biodiversity, or kind of more loosely environmental that they're talking about. They're also talking about social issues quite specifically, talking about pay, inequality, racial discrimination, obviously human rights will always be very important issues for companies. And in hand with that, we're also seeing a kind of growth in kind of reporting requirements for companies on social issues. So obviously in the UK, we have our gender pay gap reporting, modern slavery reporting as well. In the EU, we have a broader range of social issues that are going to be reported on as well. And in the US, we're seeing the SEC, they're recently looking to strengthen their human capital reporting. And as we kind of take more steps with, for instance, with the IFRS Foundation, we expect that kind of those social issues will continue to kind of become more an important part of companies' reporting regulations that are expected to follow. However, as Marty said, social issues have often been kind of regarded as the kind of the issue at the side when it comes to mainstream reporting. And whereas we've seen kind of great steps for climate reporting in these last few years, and increasingly seeing that for water biodiversity, it hasn't really been the same for social issues. So that kind of all adds up to mean that as we're expecting regulations to increase and those kind of standards to be released, not many companies are that well prepared for that kind of step up. And And we thought that a big part of that was the fact that there isn't this reporting framework that's clearly aligned to the mainstream model to really help companies be able to provide that information that's so important for investors on social issues across the board. So, you know, that's human rights, that's workers' rights, that's workplace conditions, that's consumer rights, etc., etc. So what we wanted to do was take what we've done for environmental issues with the CDSB framework and expand that to social and draw out those connections as well. So, you know, we have reporting on environmental issues, we have reporting on social issues, but we also have reporting at the interconnection of those issues. And we thought that the principles and our requirements taken broadly were applicable to social issues. When we thought about what investors and other users would want of mainstream information, we didn't think there was anything missing. So, you know, we've made a few tweaks to our principles and requirements, but broadly, they stuck the same. However, when it comes to the guidance, we've aligned with the kind of key ideas in the market. So that's kind of human and social capital, for instance, to kind of accompany our expectations on natural capital reporting. But we've also kind of tried to develop our framework to ensure that it's aligned with those kind of international expectations around business and human rights, which are set out in the UN Guiding Principles and kind of also replicated in the OECD guidelines for multinational companies. And just to get into a few more key areas of development to kind of assist companies in thinking about how they can report on social in the mainstream report, we're focusing on 4 key groups. So that's workers. So that's our company's immediate workers. It's workers in the value chain, and then it's consumers, and then it's communities as well. And with that, we've underpinned that with human rights. So thinking about the realization of human rights for those groups, but also sticking with our materiality lens of ensuring that this information is what the investor wants, and it allows for that connectivity of information throughout the report and with the backend. Now, obviously, very different worlds, social and environmental. So stakeholder engagement is a very key part of this, and we think that it's more generally going to improve our framework, as Laura touched on as well, kind of speaking to communities, speaking to consumers. Having that engagement will allow companies to realize the risks, the opportunities, and also think about which kind of metrics are most appropriate, which strategies are most appropriate to develop a company's reporting. So including that in our framework was also a big part of it. And also kind of providing more detail on supply chains as well. And in hand with that was also strengthening and adding to what we've already got in the framework to ensure that we cover the key elements of due diligence, which we expect to see coming through in reporting regulations increasingly for the next few years. More generally, because we had the opportunity to, we haven't updated our framework in a few years. So we've tried to kind of tweak a few areas, ensure some clarity where sometimes we've heard from the market that it ain't so clear. And we've also tried to ensure that in the guidance, we're allowing companies to report in an interconnected way. So asking them, say, how does your strategy on climate change affect your workers? What does this opportunity for one issue mean for risks of another? Kind of drawing out those connections and ensure that we get interconnected, high quality and useful information to the market on social and environmental information, not information issues.
Thanks, David. I mean, it's no small feat what you guys have managed to pull off with the update to this framework, and I'm delighted to say we will be launching this next Thursday afternoon UK time as part of our official sunsetting party and event. So there's joining details at the end, and I'll give you some more information. Now, before we look to the future, what does reporting in the next 5, 10 years and even months look like? I've just got 2 questions I'd like the team to answer in the chat. So we've got one from Richard Harrison. Hi, Richard. Are there any materials for implementing the TCFD for asset management industry, specifically hedge funds and public equities rather than PE? Can you please take that for me, Sandeep?
Sure. So for anything and everything TCFD related, the starting point I recommend all of our listeners to look to is the TCFD Hub, which is something actually the CDSB has hosted up until now. If you look at a resource database, and there you can filter by industry group. And so we have a kind of filter for asset managers and asset owners. And on that kind of that listing, we have resources from any organization that has developed anything specific to your sector, organization, geography is already filtered by. So for example, includes stuff by the PRI, have done some excellent work for the investment community, so both kind of private equity, but also listed equities and other kind of asset classes. So I very much direct you to the TCFD Hub.
So you broke up a little bit there, Sundip. So just in case it wasn't clear, go to the TCFD Hub, and that address has been put in the chat. Filter resources by financial services, then asset managers and asset owners, and you'll get what you need there to help you. And if not, come back to us, and we'll literally send you the direct link to get right there. We have another one about interconnectivity in the chat between the various environmental areas. Why separate them as different planetary boundaries? Is there an effective way to show this interrelationship? And Laura, would you mind taking that, please?
This is a great question, actually. So I think in terms of the planetary boundaries, in order to understand them at all, you need to understand them individually first. If you were to look at them all at the same time, it would be extremely complicated. So to understand and evaluate each one of them individually before you can start looking at interconnections makes sense. The planetary boundaries themselves will be interconnected. So just as an example, if you were to eliminate climate change completely or massively improve climate change, then that would go a long way of stopping biodiversity loss, because you'd also eliminate the temperature change and the associated issues with species migrations. In terms of how do you report this or how do you demonstrate this, I think first of all the key is understanding it. So measuring these impacts, measuring these risks, taking the time to understand what the implication of this is for your organisation, and then reporting on those in an integrated manner. But I also think diagrams in the mainstream report can be really helpful here, or figures that actually visually show how they are connected. So starting from one risk or one impact, what then are the associated implications for other natural capital or social issues? The use of valuation can be really interesting here as well, whether it's in the mainstream report or not, just to help and to identify the magnitudes of the interconnections and how they relate to each other. So I personally think that's a really interesting point of kind of understanding how they connect together.
Laura, and another one sort of along that line, which I'm going to direct towards Ravi. How do you treat double materiality?
That's a really good question. Just really building upon what Laura had mentioned. I think let's not get too confused around financial materiality and double materiality. I think it's really important to ensure that a company understands its impacts and how that can ultimately have an impact on the company. It's a bit of a mutual relationship here. So you can really only figure out one by understanding the other. So it's called a concept of called dynamic materiality, and ultimately what CDSB is focused on is information which is material to the investor, but it doesn't mean that you completely forget about the other. As Laura had mentioned in her slides around water and biodiversity, you really do need to have an understanding of your impacts on on the environment and wider society. So ultimately what we're asking for is a bit of a double materiality assessment here, but ultimately the information which you report within your mainstream financial disclosure is very much specific to the investor. So hopefully that addresses your question.
Thank you, Ravi, and please do keep the questions coming. We love them. We had a really animated session this morning, and we'd love to have an answer all your questions this afternoon as well. So Ravi, let's move forward. Let's look to the future now. We've looked at the past, we've looked at the last 15 years, we looked where we got to. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we're sort of counting down the last few days of CDSB, and I always said, well, we never need to last more than 10 years. We're just filling a gap. It is 15 years. The founders of CDSB really did have the foresight of what was going to be required in the future. So on November 3, it was announced that as part of the International Sustainability Standards Board being established, we would be consolidating into that to give the new board the staff and the IP the running start that it needs to be able to produce high quality sustainability standards, looking at enterprise value to the market, and create that sort of global baseline that we're needed to get the consistent, comparable, decision useful information. So Ravi, you're one of the technical brains leading the drafting of all of these new standards. Tell us about what to expect now over the next few months and even years.
Yeah, of course, it's a really exciting point which we've found ourselves in, and really excellent work across multiple different organisations. The fantastic team which you have in front of yourselves now, SASB, TCFD, the World Economic Forum, and the Integrated Reporting Council. So next steps are that the IFRS Foundation, via the ISSB, will be releasing into the market 2 exposure drafts, one to do with the general requirements and another one to do with climate, Q1 this year. So this is a fantastic opportunity to create that global baseline, and for you to all interact with this, this future standard via this exposure draft, and input into this. Do you agree with it? If you don't agree with it, comment on it. So please do take that opportunity to really explore that, those exposure drafts further. The general requirements is overarching. It covers all sustainability related financial matters. So it can cover off all of the matters which we've discussed here. And then also going out to the market is a particular theme, climate. We focus quite a lot on that today. But ultimately, the vision of the IFRS is, look, we're going to start with climate, but ultimately we've got a sustainability scope here. So it's really, it's really exciting stuff here. And as Marty had mentioned, we're really happy to be consolidated by the IFRS Foundation. We were set up in lieu of this. So for us, it really is mission accomplished. And in the interim, I just need to stress this: don't wait until those standards are fully done and dusted. It may take a year for that to actually fully turn around and get mandated in the different jurisdictions which you're operating in. But in the interim, having just come from a preparer perspective, it takes time to really implement these things which we're talking about today in your business. Get started now. You've got some wonderful resources which have been developed by some really fine minds within this organizations, with the help of world experts here. So do use that. And we haven't reinvented the wheel here. We've signposted to other organizations within this space, including SASB, for example. So please use those resources. If you've got any questions, you've got 10 days left of us, we can respond that. But we're also more than happy to actually help you on your journey when in the IFRS Foundation as well. So yeah, please do stay connected. Hopefully that addressed your question there, Marty.
It certainly does. And the 2 key points I took away from that was get started. You have a lot of this information as a business inside your organization already. Have a look at it, see if you've got the right controls on it, see if it's being prepared the right way. Think about the rigor on it, thinking if it stacks up to enforcement and audit provisions. I think, you have it, start thinking, have a look, get the checklist, download the checklist, have a look, work through it. As they said, there's plenty of resources out there. We've had a few questions about whether or not the slides and presentation is available today. All of this will be available on the internet afterwards, and it will be circulated to you. There is also an archive of more dedicated presentations on everything that we've covered today as well. So you can log on and access all of that information as well. I've just seen, here we go. We've got another question in the chat. If the investor only cares about impact, as long as it creates a risk back to the organization, then the organization would not care about the impacts to the planet. This has a risk of not acting on the urgency of the climate and biodiversity crisis. I think that leads us a little bit back to the double materiality, dynamic materiality point. Laura, Ravi, David, Sandip, who would like to address that one head on?
David, wait, yeah, go on, David. Good man.
Yeah, I can do. So I think what's important here is that we're actually seeing in the market that investors are interested in this information. Back 10 years ago, it would have been a handful of investors who would have probably been interested in what companies are reporting on climate change. Now it's very much the majority. If you've got the biggest asset holder in the world demanding climate change information and demanding certain metrics on climate change, then that's illustrative of the shift that's happened. And I think that kind of shows how far we've come, and it also shows the demand that companies should be reporting on this. And it's also about thinking not just about those kind of like immediate investors, but also prospective investors, and you've got to appreciate that kind of wide scope of information demand. As I was saying earlier, I think everyone is beginning to realize that how significant the physical impacts of climate change and biodiversity will be, and also how big the scale of the transformation is required to kind of meet the kind of Paris Agreement targets, and hopefully the biodiversity targets that will come soon as well. And that's obviously going to require private capital, and there's going to be lots of opportunities. So while there might be a few laggards still who dismiss this as kind of not important, increasingly it's only going in one direction.
Could I just come in here as well, Marty, if you don't
Please.
mind? Just building upon what David had mentioned, if there is also a risk to your company from climate, biodiversity, water, social issues, how will the company go about, trying to mitigate that risk? What strategies will they put in place to mitigate that? So ultimately, they will have to address those risks within their business, within their supply chain. So if they've got child labour issues within their supply chain, they have to go about and try and address that. So ultimately, it goes to the crux of the question here. Those issues, those risks outside of the company will ultimately be addressed via this, this analysis, this exposure of these risks of the company from a financial perspective, because ultimately the only way to actually address it is to get to the bottom of it and address some of these sustainability risks.
Thanks, Ravi. And Julia, can I have the next slide up, please? So as we've been talking about, we're moving across the IFRS Foundation to give the new board a running start on the 1st of February. All of our resources will remain on our website. Our website will remain intact and frozen. So all of the documents that we've talked about today are there to help you start using the app, the new standards that the general requirements that will be coming out of the IFRS Foundation. All of this guidance, all of the rest of our framework can be used to report against that in the absence of the ISSB actually having standards gone through due diligence. There is no reason not to get started, and I would urge you all to get started very, very quickly. So we are shutting our doors and the team are being transferred. I would urge, if you follow us now on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on our website, on our newsletter, to move across to the new channels. The details are here. They're also be on our social media posts over the next week. Please do start to migrate. The content will be, I promise, just as good and just as engaging, possibly even better. We have more minds to work on it. And do join us. Pop it in your diary. Sign up live. Next Thursday evening, we'll be having here in the UK time an online event with the past and present alumni of CDSB, as well as the new chair of the ISSB, previous staff, current staff, our friends and contributors from around the world, all contributing to thinking about just where we've come from over the last 15 years. And for those that maybe remember some of those conversations around the first 15 years, I joke about it sometimes, but those early meetings we had, astrophysicists talking about the carbon molecules at one end and the accountants the other side of the room, cycling each other, saying, I don't recognize you, you're not familiar. And we had to bridge these massive gaps even to get, the very first framework. And that took us years, right? Really first framework out the door and have these different stakeholder groups start to understand each other. So it's definitely been a journey. I think I've got a few of the scars of the last 10 years of my time here, but it's certainly been fun. So do join us next week. It will be a really good fun event, and also a good opportunity for us to thank you as well for not just following us, but supporting us in all the ways that you have as a community. And we couldn't be more grateful for that. Have we got any more questions in the chat before I shut off? Lots of congratulations. Thank you, everyone. That's very kind. I don't have any more questions coming through, but if they are, please do send them through to us. We are always here to help you. Absolutely always here to help. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'd be remiss if I didn't finish this webinar by thanking my absolute fabulous technical colleagues on the call here that have really led the way, broken down some of those, really big challenges, because when you're writing something that no one's done it before, it's not easy. It's not easy, and you have to do some serious thinking and triangulating and listening and thinking, proper thought leadership, and then get it tested and have your ideas kicked around a bit. And it takes people of really tough, intelligent stuff to really pull this off, and I'm really privileged to have led the team with such a robust technical gang supporting me. So thank you, Laura, Sandeep, David, Ravi. We were always a team. We always work together. Thank you again, and thank you again to you as our audience. We do this for you. We enjoy doing it with you, and we hope that you'll come on the journey with us to help create the global baseline and engage in that process. So thank you again. I'll see you next Thursday. Do sign up. And as always, have a safe evening, everyone. Bye-bye.